Welcome back, everyone, to the Towards Data Science podcast. Now, I'll just go ahead and start this episode with a quick confession. I thought today's guest, Gillian Hadfield, was an expert in the philosophy of explainable AI and how it applies to regulations like GDPR or Canada's new proposed Bill C11. That seemed like plenty of expertise for one person, and it would have made for an interesting episode in its own right. But it turns out I was wrong. In addition to her background in law and economics at Stanford, and yes, her work on explainable and justifiable AI, Gillian is also knowledgeable about AI safety and AI alignment research. In fact, I can confidently say she's the only AI policy expert we've ever had on the podcast who's brought up Goodhart's law and the concrete problems in AI safety paper. Now, the result was a wide-ranging conversation about explainable AI, analogies between the law and AI alignment, and the future of AI regulation as well. And Gillian joined me to talk about all those things and more on this episode of the Towards Data Science podcast. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I overheard a talk that you gave at the Canada School of Public Service a couple of months ago. And as I listened to it, I was like, okay, I have to talk to Gillian. I mean, this is going to be a great conversation about a really important set of topics. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of what we'll be discussing, talking about explainable AI and maybe the strengths and weaknesses of that whole concept, I'd love to get a sense for your background. So what brought you to the space of AI, especially given that you started off in economics, am I right?
I did. So I did a PhD in economics and a law degree as a joint degree back at Stanford, decades and decades ago. But I actually feel like the things I'm working on now are kind of coming back around to what motivated me and interested me in that combination, which was, using kind of formal modeling and formal methods, empirical work and so on, to understand the big questions. What's the just way to organize societies? So I sort of feel like with some detours along the way and organizational economics and so on, I kind of feel like I'm back to what motivated me in the first place.
That's great. Yeah, it does seem to happen so much too. I mean, everything is so interconnected, and I guess that's actually part of what makes this so complicated. To frame this conversation, I think it might be helpful to start with like the big motivating events, the things that have gotten folks in policy, folks in privacy interested in AI most recently. I think maybe, and you might correct me on this, but I think the two biggest events here are GDPR in Europe on the one hand, and then more recently Bill C11 in Canada, at least specifically for us as we're both Canadians, on the other. So I'd love to get a sense from you for what the big highlights are privacy-wise of these two bits of legislation, and just your general thoughts on what you'd like to highlight there.
So I think the GDPR, which came down I think it became effective about 2018. It was preceded by some decisions out of the European Court of Justice about the right to be forgotten, which you might remember. It was sort of one of the big first comprehensive pieces of legislation starting to think about really the massive transformation that's coming from huge quantities of digital information and what's being done with all that data. Now it grew out of, we've had privacy legislation in lots of countries in the EU and bits and pieces in parts of Canada as well. And of course, some in the US, the regulation of medical data with the Health Information Protection Act there. So I think that was kind of the first big comprehensive approaches. And everybody was thinking then about data. Everybody was thinking about, gosh, we've gone from data is the stuff in records and, like big Excel sheets everywhere or digitized Excel sheets. Now we've got, we're aware that data is being collected with everything we do, every click we make, every song we listen to, all of that is generating massive quantities of data. So I think this was the first, big steps towards, what are we going to do about this big transformation of societies in terms of data?
And the privacy-related measures, I guess, or the talk about privacy in the context of GDPR and C11, they both included some talk about sort of explanation, rights to explanation, inviting, I mean, like, I guess this is one point of ambiguity is, do we really have a definition of what explanation means in that context? Like, what are some of your thoughts on that? Because I know you've done a lot of research in that area, a lot of thinking in that area.
Yeah, sure. So the big messages of GDPR and Bill C-11. So GDPR is in effect. Bill C-11 is still just proposed legislation in Canada. Like I say, they're primarily focused on privacy, which are concepts we've had around for a long time, constitutional concepts, and they focused on the idea of, hey, people should have a right to control over their data or a right to decide when it's used. But one of the ways in which all that data is being used, and of course, really what's driving the production of all that data, is that people are building machine learning systems on that data. And that's why it's so valuable, because it's being used to train machine learning systems that are then producing automated decision processes that are deciding things like, what you're seeing in your news feed, or people are using them to sift through job applications or credit loan applications, where we're starting to see them, governments start to explore how to use it. So then we started to say, oh, there's this other thing around data that maybe we're worried about, which is how it's being used, not just how it's being collected and processed and held. What do you know about me? But how are you using that to make decisions that might affect me? And so what we saw in the GDPR was one of the provisions in there says that people have a right to an explanation of how a decision that was made using all that data, using an automated process, a right to an explanation of how that decision was reached. And Bill C-11 in Canada also includes something similar. They're not the same in all the details, and it's a little bit of an overstatement for the GDPR to say you have a right to an explanation about any decision. It's a little narrower than that. But it introduced this idea of oh, we need explainable AI. We need AI that's making decisions we can understand and get an account of. That actually connected up with what was starting to emerge in the computer science world from, actually, some of it was coming out of military contexts in the US. People who were starting to say, if we're going to design and use these systems, I think we need to understand how they work. So there's a lot of things that people mean by explainable AI, or the right to an explanation, and it's really important to kind of separate out those differences.
Yeah, because I imagine when you talk about like a defense military technical application of AI, and you say like, okay, explain this drone's decision to pull the trigger and shoot this person. There's one level of explanation that comes from that. Well, okay, it happened because neuron number 175 fired, and it fired because these other neurons fired, and so on, which is a very kind of reductive explanation. But then there's another level that's sort of more practical and says, oh, well, it fired because this person had these features that we correlated with the appearance of some member of the Taliban or something, and so we pulled the trigger. And then an even higher level still is like, well, it fired because the private who was piloting the drone gave license to the algorithm to make this decision. It seems like there are all these different layers of explanation. How do you think about which layer applies, and how do you think governments are thinking about that in the context of this legislation?
Yeah, so it's really important to really focus on the idea that there's both different layers and different purposes for explanation. And it's the purpose you want to put the explanation to that really we should be thinking about when we're saying, well, what do we mean by an explanation? Now, maybe it helps to have a little bit of background here for any listeners who don't kind of know all the details of machine learning and why is this a challenge. But just to get everybody up on the same page here, the challenge here is that our machine learning models are increasingly massive, and they consist of thousands, millions, in the case of big language models, billions of parameters. And it's really not something this gets referred to as, as the black box problem. It's really not very easy to say, well, why did the model put the label of a cat on that image? Or why did why did it score that particular application for credit low? To understand, how did the model work? If you had a really simple mathematical model, you could tell, right? You just had like 5 variables in it. You said, well, there's the coefficient on age. That's, we can tell exactly why it behaved that way. So the first type of explanation people are talking about, and this is the one that computer scientists are thinking about, and say, DARPA, when they started talking about explainable AI, they're talking about the causal account. How did the math transform that input into this output? And that's a very challenging thing to do when you've got these big complex models. But it's the kind of thing you'd want to know in order to say, okay, why does it make mistakes? Maybe you'll learn that, oh, the reason it labeled that picture there's an example that gets talked about of the, people who trained a model to tell the difference between pictures of huskies and wolves. I don't know if anybody on talking about. Yes, exactly. You gave away the punchline there.
Sorry.
That's right. So train a model to tell the difference between huskies and wolves. You get great accuracy on your test set, and then you go and you look for an explanation of why it made a mistake in one case, and discover actually you trained a model to recognize snow because all your pictures of wolves were on snow and all the pictures of dogs were on grass or dirt or rock or something. So explanations like that help you understand how is your system producing, can help you make a safer system, can help you reduce errors, can give you more, a more robust system that when you send it out into the real world, it's actually behaving the way you expect it to. So there's that kind of explanation, and it's quite important. But if we go back to the GDPR and think about automated decision making, when they say you, citizen, resident, data owner, have a right to an explanation about how your data was used to reach an automated decision, most of those people are not at all interested in the causal story of, what neurons fired, or, what weight was attached to what feature. I think what they want is what I call a justification. And I actually advocate for us to start using that term, that really the GDPR should say, you have a right to a justification of a decision made using an automated decision process. Because what that person is looking for is like what our legal systems give us. The right to say, hey, you didn't give me a loan, or you denied me that job, and I think you violated the rules when you did that. You didn't look at my application carefully. You didn't take into account the material I sent you. You discriminated against me on a prohibited ground. That's really what we mean, I think, when you see this impulse from the European Parliament to say, oh, we need explanations. It's, people have a right to be given an account of why the decision made by the machine is acceptable, given all the rules we have about, and the standards and norms we have around how we make decisions.
And is part of that distinction, again, I mean, I'm probably wrong with this, but it feels like part of the flavor here is an explanation seems like an affirmative statement about, here were the things that mattered, here are the things that I factored in, whereas a justification seems like an assurance that certain things were not factored in, or certain processes were not violated. Is that part of the distinction between the two, or?
It could be, because a lot of our rules and rights are about things like, things that you can't do, like you can't take my race or gender into account when you're deciding on whether I'm a good candidate for the job. Some of them you might say, and some of them might be, well, you were supposed to do this and you didn't. So, if, you might say, well, there's kind of an implied right. We don't have this expressed in many places, but there's an implied right that if I apply for a job, you're going to review the materials I sent you. Now, some employers will always make it clear, we reserve the right not to look at your application at all. Like we liked the first one we saw and we stopped looking at that point. But suppose you're in an environment where it was thought, no, it's appropriate, or maybe you're up for a promotion. Mm-hmm. That's a more likely context where you'd say, hey, you had to actually look at my record of work to decide if I was entitled to this promotion. So we might there say, hey, the thing you were supposed to do is look at my application, and you didn't do that. You didn't treat me, you didn't in good faith evaluate my candidacy. But I think the more fundamental difference here is, in the first instance, when we're talking about that real explainable AI, the way computer scientists are understanding that, machine learning engineers are understanding that, that's really how is the network operating? What's happening inside the model? Mm-hmm. That is a mathematical type question, a structural question, an architecture question. In the case of a justification for a decision, an automated decision, we may not really even care at all what's happening inside the model. And we may not know what to do about it anyway. The justification may be kind of running in parallel, not really connected with what's happening inside the model, because it's very much like when a judge makes a decision. You know, if a judge decides you're guilty, in our systems, our legal systems, we feel trust and confidence, to the extent that we do, in our judges making those decisions, because we have a system of accountability that requires them to give reasons for their decisions. And the reasons they give have to be consistent with the rules. It can't be, I denied you parole because I was grumpy and hungry for lunch. You know, it's got to be, I denied you parole because of your behavior and our estimates of risk or something. Now, we don't actually know what's going on in the judge's head.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna ask, because this is one of the things that often I think as more of a a technical person, I reflexively have this sort of reaction where somebody says, well, we need explainable AI, or we need whatever feature of AI, and it kind of makes me think, well, wait a minute, a bit of a double standard here. I mean, we don't have explainable humans. We think we do. We often are presented with the appearance of an explanation, but there are all kinds of motives that underlie things. There's a lack of introspection. Like I don't have full access to my own cognition, let alone that of other people. So for me to claim that I can even provide an explanation, I can't even peer into, yet with machine learning models, you can at least crack them open and say, hey, objectively, this is how that decision was made. So yeah, how do you think about that sort of distinction?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's a combination of, right, like we don't actually know what neurons are firing in a person's head when they're making a decision. We wouldn't really even know what to do with that information if we did. But what we've done is we've created control mechanisms based on the obligation to provide reasons, to share them publicly, and then have them evaluated by a disciplined community of kind of protectors of the consistency of our reasoning, which is the way I think about what lawyers do and judges, right? I train lawyers. I'm a law professor, and I'm teaching them to recognize, oh no, this would be a good use of that case as precedent, or this would be a defensible interpretation of a term in a contract or a statute, or this is a defensible or not defensible reason for reaching a legal conclusion. And that's observable stuff. And I say it's governed by this system of reasoning, and then these experts in reasoning, as well as the public, right? Like you also have to explain it to the public. So it's not only professionals and experts in a particular kind of reasoning. And I think that's something that we need to think a lot more about with respect to machine learning, because we've gone down this rabbit hole. Oh, we need to explain to people how the model works, and that will satisfy. I'm saying, well, no, they won't understand. Very few. What's the meaning of, this this node in the third layer,
Yeah.
this part of the network lit up.
Yeah, even among technical specialists, there's debate. I had a prof at the Vector Institute on a couple of months ago, and he was talking about the controversy over what counts as an explanation, even within the technical community. So
Right.
there's clearly no consensus. Yeah.
Exactly, and I say, but we're kind of we're kind of barking up the wrong tree there. What we should be doing is saying, can you justify the decision? We don't know exactly how it was reached, and so so when the judge who decides that you're not getting parole, let's suppose that the actual causal explanation is that judge was grumpy and wanted lunch. Okay, that might be the causal explanation. But if the judge can justify that decision and say, well, yeah, I was grumpy and I wanted lunch, but I can go and look and I say, yeah, and here's the legitimate reasons why I exercise my discretion to not grant you parole. And that's how our regulation of the way that decision-making process works. And we're not really kind of focused on like, what's, are you lined up completely with the causal explanation? Is it a justifiable decision?
I was just going to draw the data science analogy here. So we have, when you train neural networks, you have things that are called regularization terms that you add to your system, basically to, like, in a way, minimize how wild the sensitivity and the variance of the outputs of the system can be. This kind of sounds like a regularization term on judicial behavior, where it's like you can be grumpy, your grumpiness can affect your behavior, but not beyond the point where it prevents you from being able to justify your explanation. So we're going to accept some amount of variance. Hard cases make bad law, so we're not going to crack that open and get too nitpicky within that boundary, but you need to be within that boundary. That's sort of the idea here.
Yeah, that's a nice analogy. And that's why thinking about it as a system, right? A control system that says, what we're aiming for here is that our decisions across a set of decisions that are being made, across a whole institution that's making decisions, a whole process, are reasonably well aligned with the rules we set for how those are supposed to be made. But yeah, there's going to be noise, there's going to be variance. And one of the things that we actually include in our legal systems is we actually include lots of fuzziness. We have lots of places where there's discretion and vagueness. And, I teach contract law, and I find that, my economist colleagues are often really kind of shocked when they see what real contracts look like, because economists study contracts as equations, right? We're going to solve for the optimal compensation schedule to secure incentives. And then you go look at the way actual commercial contracts are written, and they're filled with words like, we'll set a reasonable price, commercially reasonable terms, we'll exercise good faith, we'll take best efforts. There's a lot of fuzziness. And the reason for that is that we know that it's actually really complex to make decisions. There's a ton of information to process, and there's a ton of factors. So we kind of want our judges and our contracting parties and so on to have that room to take into account something that, we didn't specify up front. We didn't put it into the model ahead of time or into the contract ahead of time. And then we put the bounds on it. We say, okay, and we'll give you that room to move around, and that'll allow you to be actually a little bit better adaptive to any particular situation. But we're going to have to cabin that to say, well, but you got to be able to explain it. You got to be able to fit it into our system of reasoning. You may have decided it for a different reason, but you have to justify it, and that's with our existing reasons. And that's this, really, it's organic, it's vital, it's a system for moving a system.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these things, we want to think about them from that systemic point of view.
Yeah, and to your point about the sort of aesthetic preferences of economists and quants who look at this and go like, oh, but it's not perfect, you can't put it in an equation. It's also, maybe ironically, like there's an economic principle behind this called Goodhart's law that we talk about in the context of AI safety on the podcast, where, right, the moment that you that you define a measure and make it a target for optimization, it ceases to be a good measure for the thing you're trying to optimize. And like the canonical example for this is maybe the stock market. In the 1900s, the stock market was a great indicator of how the broader American economy was doing. Get a sense for how the average person is doing, look at the stock market. Today, things get really decoupled because people find ways to hack it. Like you have this well-defined metric, people are intelligent enough and systems of people are intelligent enough to find clever ways to kind of get around it. And the moment you define a concrete boundary, people will figure out how to hack it. And so contracts and definitions of privacy seem to follow in kind of the same category in that sense. Is that part of this from your perspective, like that flexibility to make sure that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so absolutely. So we're doing a bit of a pivot here, but from the explanation justification stories, but maybe it's a good direction. So the economics that I was doing was back when I did my PhD, the area I've focused on is sort of the work on a theory of incomplete contracts. And this was a recognition that came about for economists talking to, we had law people starting to connect up with people in economics. As I mentioned, I did that as a joint degree at Stanford, sigh, in the 80s. And sort of the recognition was just coming around that, we have these theories of what we call complete contingent contracts. Basically put into the contract every variable that's going to make a difference for outputs, and then you can you can easily solve mathematically that you then want to, condition on everything that affects the output, that metric you're talking about that you're going to compensate on. So you get these. So we had these mechanism design papers and so on that had these very complicated contractual structures, and as I mentioned, we then go look and see that they're quite vague. But one of the big insights there was contracts are always incomplete. We never, ever anticipate everything that's going to happen, every possible condition, every contingency. And in fact, there's lots of reasons why it may not make sense to do that. Maybe too expensive. We have strategic obstacles to doing that. It may require me to reveal private information to you that I don't want to reveal to you in negotiations. So we started to recognize that contracts were necessarily and inevitably incomplete. So we had to start analyzing the problem. Okay, what's the optimal incomplete contract? What's the best way to design an incomplete contract to deal with the fact that you're never going to anticipate everything? So my co-author and also son, Gillian Hadfield, who just started it as a assistant.
We've had him on the podcast. I had
All
no
right.
idea.
You had no idea. There you go. So we have a paper, Incomplete Contract and AI Alignment, which basically says, look, the incomplete contracting problem lines up with your misspecification, your alignment problem in AI. And, you have to kind of make that same transition from saying, we will fix our misspecification problem by getting better at specification. We will get everything in there. And I say, no, you need to accept you will never get everything in there. So what's your best design for the incompleteness, right? So what is your best design for the fact you're never going to get everything in there? And the reason is it's a complex world. It's a dynamic world. The whole point of the world is we keep inventing new things and new relationships and new responses, and shocks happen and wild things happen, and it's constantly dynamic. So you shouldn't even start with the idea that we'll solve this problem by nailing down everything. It's actually functional that we've got all that ambiguity in there because we don't want to lock ourselves in. You do not want to live in the world where you could say, look, I want to be able to look up the rule and know exactly what I'm supposed to do. You actually don't want to live in that world.
Yeah, I'm sort of chuckling to myself that you've got to be the first economist we've had on the podcast who's made reference to AI alignment research. So this is definitely
we go.
One for the bingo card. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Dylan, I had no idea you were related to Dylan. That's fascinating, and it kind of opens up a whole different range of interactions between these two fields. So you mentioned AI alignment. I guess that's where the Goodhart law piece comes in.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. And so what were some of the principles that, or were you able to identify any principles that you could use to kind of shore up these contracts, make them as robust as possible, given that, you're never going to get to that point of...
Well, so there's one really So I know in the AI world, lots of discussion about Goodhart's law, which I'm an economist, heard about it, but I sort of think of it as a macroeconomic concept. It was about like what instruments should the government use to set monetary policy and so on. And the version that I want to think about is sort of like, famous work about the multitasking problem. This particular one is Paul Milgram, who's one of my advisors at Stanford, also just won the Nobel Prize for actually his auction work, but and Bengt Holmstrom. And this is the idea that and actually it's really great. It's like, so, think about teachers. You have the things you'd like teachers to do are you'd like their students to, learn how to do arithmetic and measurable stuff, but you also would like them to learn how to do very hard to measure stuff, like be creative or be good citizens or whatever. And what they show is that if you can only measure, like your instinct might be, well, if you can measure the performance on the math tests, you should tie incentives to the performance on the math test. But if you do that, you'll teach to the test, right? The teachers are going to start saying, well, my income depends on the performance of my students on math tests. So I'm just going to spend all my time teaching them math, and I'm going to forget teaching them how to be creative thinkers or good citizens. I don't get compensated. Of course, our teachers don't do that because we actually have a whole set of norms that fill this in, which is another point that we make. So I think of that as one of the really key insights is just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should put it into your system. Doesn't mean that you should crank your incentives to that. Doesn't mean that you should train your system. So self-driving cars, right? Okay, you can measure speed, you can measure likelihood of crashing and leaving the lane. Yeah, much harder to measure how cooperative and is the car being with other drivers on the road. So the lesson of that is once you recognize you're going to be missing things, you don't want to crank down on all the things you can measure. So I think of that as so Goodhart's law says metrics won't become good metrics. This just says we have to think about what you can measure in light of what you can't measure and what your true overall objective is.
It's such an interesting point, and you even touched on something that might be its own kind of can of worms, but the idea that the gap between Goodhart's law and good kind of implementations of policy is culture, and that to the extent that teachers do a good job, it's because there are these norms that it's not enough to just max out the score on this test. You have to kind of broadly produce an enlightened student base, because otherwise you're sort of not doing your job. And I guess the same applies to other professions too, right? I mean, a police officer might fill a quota, but they might do it in a horrible way, or so on.
Yeah, one of the key insights that Dylan and I sort of pull out in this paper now talk a lot about is, okay, so human contracts are always incomplete, but why is it still rational for us to enter into those contracts? So, I want to hire a person to do a job, make it really simple. You'll understand why I choose this example in a minute. You want to get them to carry boxes from one side of the room to the other. And what you can do is you can pay them per box, right? That's measurable. You can do that. But stuff might happen, right? The expensive vase might appear in the middle of the room, or the cat might come in, or somebody might need help because they have a heart attack in a corner of the workspace. And those things are not included you can't include all those things in the contract because it's not worth it. You can't think about them all, et cetera. You're not going to have those in the contract. But we live in an environment of a whole bunch of rich institutional infrastructure, norms and laws and so on, that basically fill in the gaps. They fill in the gaps in the incomplete contract. So in fact, my contract consists of the express stuff that we filled in, or even the implied from what we talked about. But then it has all the environment right? The environment fills in all that contract so that, if the employee sees an expensive vase appear in the room, employee's going to think twice before just plowing through it and say, well, the employer didn't say anything about whether I should, protect the vase, because, person's going to say, I live in an environment where if you go around causing property damage to other people's stuff, people don't like you, they don't hire you, they maybe sue you, they withhold your wages, and everybody says that's okay, and the court will enforce it, and so on. So you have that way of filling in that. Now you might recognize the example from concrete problems in AI safety.
I was going to say, this is really getting cool.
Yeah. So, and that's why we chose the example to say, like, so here's our problem when it's a robot that we have trained to carry the boxes. And we thought, what we want, what do we try to accomplish with this little robot we're training? Our objective is carry boxes to the other side of the room. We didn't think about vases appearing once that robot was deployed out there in the world. And then oops, right? So that's what this group of authors identifies as, here's a safety problem in AI. We trained for this, but oops, we didn't think about this other thing. And we say, yep, you're never going to think about everything. So what should you do? So we say, look, part of what you have to recognize is the only way we solve that problem for humans is with a bunch of external infrastructure. So how do we do that with AI systems? How do we do that for robots so that a robot would be thinking, never seen a vase before, wasn't in the training data. What do I think humans would think?
Yeah.
And so now we're back to like my law side and right, the normative infrastructure in which all of our interactions are embedded. How are we going to build our systems and our robots to reference that normative infrastructure, to draw on it, to say, it's not just carrying boxes. I'm embedded in this thing. There's a lot of other things that humans care about. I better go take a look. Human is going to think hypothetically, imaginatively. What would they think if? So how do we train our robots to say, what would they think if I did that thing I've never thought of or been trained about before?
It's actually really interesting because it makes me think differently now back to my interview with Dylan, because seeing this through some of your insights shining through there, some of his insights shining through here, it's just fascinating. One thing this does make me think of, though, is how far this rabbit hole might go on the normative infrastructure side. Because at a certain point, I guess you hit bedrock, where you get to the frontier of situations that the law and the normative infrastructure haven't yet accounted for. I'm thinking of things like cutting edge technologies, maybe crypto, automation of certain things that just like we've never thought about how they could be automated, and now we have to come up with laws to deal with them. At a certain point, this kind of leaves us, I guess, hitting bedrock and wondering, like, how do we build this whole thing from scratch with very little context? And I imagine that's kind of what the GDPR thing, that's maybe the tie-in back there too, right?
So say more about that because I think there is a tie back to GDPR, but say more about how you're seeing that.
Well, I guess what I'm seeing is GDPR and Bill C-11 speak to us trying to kind of push the frontier of this normative infrastructure. Yes. There's no precedent, really. It's not like there's a set of thinking on it yet.
Right. Good. Okay, great. So what we just got to was stop thinking you're going to solve the alignment problem or the AI safety problem or responsible AI problem, by tweaking your algorithms, your data sets. Should do all those things, absolutely, right? We should do it, but we're not going to get to a solution on that. We need to build that infrastructure around it and our systems that say, I need to reach out there and recognize this is an embedded problem. So I think you're exactly right, then. That's a nice connection too. So when GDPR comes in and says, hey, people are going to be affected by these automated decisions. And you know what? Instinctively, we say you're entitled to an explanation for that. What they mean is you're entitled to a justification for that. And what do all the people who drafted that? So who drafted that stuff? A whole bunch of lawyers is for one thing. And what they're all thinking is when humans make decisions, like when we delegate to somebody else to make decisions about who gets the job or who gets the benefits or who gets the contract. We have a whole bunch of infrastructure around that legal process that says you have a right to go have somebody say, yeah, I was justified. I was justified in the decision. So that you have that infrastructure to reach around to. So I think that's a really nice way to think about. And also now you've got me thinking about a really important reason why machine learning engineers need to understand the difference between explanation and justification is that, you need to build your systems so that they are reaching out into that human structure of justification and the processes of that. And I should say that originally thinking about this, it was Dylan, and we're working on this stuff together as well. But yeah, he grew up in a household of economists and lawyers and
I can tell.
So yeah, so I think that's exactly right. So that's a really nice way to think about. I don't think anybody thought about this when they were writing up the GDPR. They were just instinctively saying, hey, in our complex societies, when people make decisions that affect you, you have a right to justification. And so they're just instinctively saying, well, of course, you're going to have that from the machine as well. So that then says, okay, now that's your design challenge. That's your engineering challenge. What does it mean to do that? And here's what it doesn't mean. Figure out like what's happening in the third layer of the network, or where the map lights up when it's showing this image versus that one. All that could be useful in coming up with reasons, but
yeah, that use of language, or the kind of language disconnect is such an interesting theme, especially when it comes from, you've got people used to using the word explanation in a legal context, and then other people in the technical context, and they just don't come eye to eye. Right. One thing this does make me think of, especially because you mentioned how GDPR was the product of lawyerly work, let's say. This seems to speak to the challenge of getting technical people involved and engaged in that process. I imagine, I know speaking to policy folks in government, recruitment is a huge problem. Just getting people who even know data analytics or data science, let alone AI alignment, which is like the niche of the niche, sort of super technical stuff. Is this something that you feel like? I mean, you have obviously special access through Dylan to this kind of talent, but is this something you feel as a kind of vulnerability or weak spot in the whole legislating process around privacy and AI, that sort of thing right now?
Yeah, so I think the challenge we're facing there is so first of all, there is, as you've noted, there's a shortage of people with this kind of training to really understand the way AI and machine learning work, and then to be able to build it. I mean, I understand how it works, but I can't build it, right? I'm not in that category. And so, yeah, number one, you have governments and places that are facing a challenge just hiring like that, and can't compete on salary, right? There's the economics for you, right? You can't, you have to have another reason to go work for the government when there's a ton of big tech and startup tech that would love to hire you at much higher rates. And I think that's a challenge, but there's two things I think I want to say about that. One is, you don't have to be able to build machine learning to understand it well enough to think through what do we need to do to regulate it? What do we need to do to make sure it's safe and good and not screwing up our societies? Again, I'll come back to me. I mean, I'm an economist, so I have technical skills. I do a lot of math, but I don't program. But I certainly understand the way machine learning works. And when we're doing a series of lectures for the Canada School of Public Service, and just recorded one of the first ones there about what is AI. And I do this when I teach to law students. I do this when I teach to business school students. And I really think it's a very important thing for people who are not computer scientists. Here are the fundamentals of how this works. You should understand the basics. And like one of the key things and why we're facing challenges here, but what's the difference between conventional programming, where there was,
Mm.
a human being who said, if X, then Y, and
Yeah.
basically wrote down all the rules for how the even complex software would work, autopilots and airplanes and so on, to machine learning, which is, here's a bunch of data, here's what we'd like you to figure out how to do. You figure out if X, then Y. And it's that shift. And that's something that I think tons of people should understand. And then understand, okay, so why does that create different kinds of risks? What is the transparency problem? And so I think we don't need to necessarily have a whole bunch more machine learning engineers in government, but we need a step jump in the sophistication of understanding. So, and I think that's perfectly accessible to anybody, smart enough to be one of our civil servants. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is, I don't think we're going to be able to solve our regulation problems with the conventional approaches to regulation, which is people, civil servants and lawyers and members of the public sitting around and writing down a bunch of rules on paper, right? It's think about the challenges around our social media platforms right now, right? We're not going to be able to sit around and write, oh, okay, so do this and don't do that and don't do that. It's going to be outdated probably the moment you first write it down. And it's not going to be sophisticated. And for that, you need like really detailed information. It's not just that you need the expertise of being a machine learning engineer. We have no idea what's going on inside the recommender systems that Facebook is building, or the systems inside Google for ranking and ad selection and so on. They're big, massive models. I work with OpenAI, GPT-3, right? We don't know. It's massive. We don't know what's going on in there, and we're not going to be able to regulate in our conventional ways. But I think what we are going to need is we're going to need technologies. We're going to need AI to help regulate AI, right? We're going to need those kinds of we're going to need technology. We need to sort of drive the production of technology that can track, probe, control, solicit justifications from, or whatever, AI systems. So one of the things that I've been advocating for is something I call regulatory markets, where we say, let's get our governments making decisions like, how safe does a self-driving car have to be? Like, what are the acceptable accident rates and, so on. But we got to drive a whole sector in the economy of, smart young people with startups who are saying, oh, I can build the technology that will get you that. I can build that. So we've actually got a little bit of this happening already with companies that are building machine learning systems to make sure that other machine learning systems aren't discriminating on the basis of race, for example, or automating with smart tools, removal of private information, going back to GDPR and privacy. And so one of the things I'm spending a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out how to build and talking to governments about is, okay, stop thinking that what you're going to do is write some complex legislation that will tell social media platforms what they do. Start thinking about how you can drive the production of the technologies that will track. Start thinking about how you're going to give access to those innovators to what they need to know. So your original question was around, okay, governments can't hire enough machine learning engineers, saying, yep, that's right. So how much is that a problem, and what is the better solution anyway?
I couldn't possibly agree more. That sounds like a lot of really sensible stuff, and getting the private sector involved in the right ways. It seems like pretty well the only path ahead for this. Is just fascinating. What a nice surprise, sort of halfway through, realizing that you're an expert on like the whole other half of what we talk about on the podcast. This was not expected
Great.
and absolutely fantastic.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I really appreciated all your insights here, Gillian. And is there anywhere people can go, like specifically that you'd recommend to learn more about your work, your research?
Sure. So I am I'm a professor of law and of strategic management at the University of Toronto, but I also direct this new institute called the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, and that's easily found. Oh, I guess you have to spell Schwartz Reisman. So I think our website is srinstitute.utoronto.ca. So that's where you can find out about the kinds of projects we're working on, and links to the videos and blog posts and so on of various of these kinds of pieces of work. And then I also have a web page that has my own work on it, including like the paper I just mentioned, the incomplete contracts and AI alignment one. Hopefully soon, the justification paper, which is really got some really cool stuff in there coming out. I do a collaboration with DeepMind, and we have some great work with multi-agent systems. So
fantastic.
Yes.
Well, we'll be sure to link to all that stuff too in the blog post that'll come with the podcast. So folks, if you're listening or watching or whatever you're doing, do check that out as well, because I suspect we'll have a lot of links to share on this one. So.
Okay, good.
Thanks so much, Gillian.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy. Very great. Thanks.